Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 10 of Series 11. The question for today is, can Aristotle's virtue theory ethics be reformulated as a value theory ethics? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 7. So in recent workshops, we have been discussing the main ethical theories of Stoic, utilitarian, and Kantian ethics. Yet despite my skepticism about ethics in general, ethical principles are values that guide moral action. A study of ethics is thereby also a study of value and values central to my philosophy of life. Briefly, my thesis is that an affirmation of or a will to value can lead to a certain quality and sufficiency of value. And this thesis also resolves problems in spheres of value like meaning, purpose, ethics, and morals. The scope of this view can be seen in that these states are all key elements of human consciousness, and that consciousness determines both the parameters and possibilities of human experience. I have previously discussed the significance of consciousness to life and to value. But today I want to discuss Aristotle's virtue theory ethics, which shares several themes with my own view. One is that Aristotle is concerned with living a good or flourishing life rather than moral action. Another is an organic rather than an algorithmic determination of human action. I will explain these different positions in due course. Yet Aristotle's virtue theory is also subject to several failings that I hope to rectify. Two of these are a neglect of value and an inability to provide a clear principle of action to act upon. My answer is to retain the celebrated conceptual framework of virtue theory, but replace the virtues and dispositions with values and value states for a value theory ethics. Yet three things that first need provisional definitions here are Aristotle's virtue theory, values, and value states. To begin with values, we should have a working knowledge of what values are, but we often don't. And I have a whole podcast as well as other writings about defining values and their neglect. Yet we must distinguish human values like wanting and hating, or morals and aesthetics, from material values of finance, quantification, enumeration, and truth values. That is, as Ralph Perry and John Mackey explain, human values are subjective. Value states is my own term for mental states that necessarily contain both values and phenomenal experience. So value states are, for example, love, hate, dignity, self-esteem, honour, moral fortitude, resentment, fear and desire. I should note that all my research and specific searches have never seen this term value states, and recent searches on both Google and ChatGPT produce the same result. I quote, "The term value states is not a standard or widely recognized term in psychology, philosophy or other fields that study human emotions, attitudes or behaviours," unquote. And in this study we can firstly define one aspect of virtue theory as other theories of ethics in terms of value. This is because, as below, the central principles of all theories of ethics are values that guide moral action. Yet we will also need to explain that for virtue theory, the virtues like temperance, courage and magnanimity translate naturally into value states. So Aristotle's virtue theory can be defined by its central values of excellence, character and human flourishing. And both Plato and Aristotle name the four cardinal virtues as temperance, justice, prudence and courage. But Kantian ethics primarily values reason, universalization and volition in the form of a certain goodwill. Utilitarianism holds the values of pragmatism and happiness for the greatest number of people. And notably in the case of value theory ethics, value itself becomes its central guiding principle. But principles of science aren't value judgments, but are facts or strictures about the world. Yet I want to reformulate Aristotle's virtue theory ethics in terms of value states and a value theory ethics. And because, as previously argued, all other theories of ethics, including virtue theory ethics, are fatally flawed, and that Aristotle's virtue theory ethics can be reformulated in terms of value states, that can lead to a viable but provisional value theory ethics that I also constructed. Yet we should at least first review the fatal flaws in these and other theories of ethics. Kantian ethics is seen as a foundational system which can also exemplify key issues that need to be analysed. We saw it as a rationalist view that lauded cognitivist motivation and universalisation as ethical principles. Problems here were that cognition is challenged both as a motivating force and as a moral foundation. And universalisation is neither realistic nor an adequate account of moral subjectivity. Yet Kant attempted to integrate the subjectivity of ethics into its apparently objective requirements with the dual status of reason, which is both objective as an aspect of logic and subjective as an integral part of mind. But although reason is integral to the mind, it isn't integral to values or moral values. So reason faces the is-ought problem and how ethical principles engage the will. Different ethical theories face this problem in different ways. In utilitarianism, happiness is an affect state of value in itself, but is neither adequate nor an intrinsic value. Existentialism advocates freedom and authenticity. These enter into moral choice in different ways, but neither freedom or authenticity can give detailed guidance for moral action. A problem for virtue theory isn't so much internalization, but the principles of action are difficult to discern. This is because on virtue theory, virtues are dispositions and the good person just knows how to act. For example, Aristotle was asked, if only the virtuous can act virtuously, how do we become virtuous? He answered, practice the virtues in order to internalize them, to become second nature. This answer may be adequate for applied or practical ethics, but it's neither adequate as a principle of action nor for a theory of ethics. Yet Aristotle did give guidance in his golden mean, or middle way of moderation between two extremes. But these extremes are set by variable social conventions and disputed references to nature. However, before converting virtue theory ethics into a value theory ethics with a viable theory of action, we need to say more about the characteristics of Aristotle's virtue theory that facilitate this conversion. As a start to this project, Elizabeth Anscombe famously criticised both Kantian and virtue ethics, whilst recommending a return to virtue ethics, as well as alluding to its neglect of moral value. She writes, the term moral just doesn't seem to fit, in its modern sense, into an account of Aristotelian ethics, because, among other reasons, Anscombe tells us it lacks the concept of a moral sense of ought. She also argued that the Kantian ideas of duty, obligation, and law given by God have weakened or have been rejected, and Anscombe advocated replacing these principles with particular virtues as held in Aristotelian ethics. this begins to make a case for a reinterpretation of virtue theory such as we are undertaking here. So we should start to look at the conceptual framework of virtue ethics in order to see its strengths and weaknesses. To start with, Aristotle regarded morality as a matter of acting out of good character or disposition. Yet acting on a disposition or an inclination to do good is oddly denigrated in Kantian ethics. But on virtue theory, acts of duty or obligation are regarded as only attempts to do good. In modern times, this also could be seen as inauthentic or actions of a do-gooder. There is also a well-known example showing how Kantian duty might be superseded by Aristotelian virtue. That is, if I did something good for a friend and told him that I did it out of duty, he would be disappointed. This is because there is something morally lacking in the idea of just acting out of duty. But virtue theory accounts for acting out of friendship, disposition, or character. Other thinkers have also appealed to Aristotle to redress an overemphasis on rationality and universality in Kant. That is, Kant exhorted absolute impartiality in, for example, treating family and strangers alike, which seems inhuman. But such rationalist and strictly objectivist ethics are confounded by the problem of moral distancing, and virtue theory's consideration of attitude and disposition seems preferable in these cases. Another distinctive feature of Aristotle's virtue ethics is its objective as the good life to live well or happiness. It's not just ethical conduct, good intention or conformity to theory as in Kantian and other ethical theories. But for Aristotle, happiness isn't just a virtue, it is eudaimonia as the final human objective. Yet pursuing happiness might be thought to be divorced from ethical or moral behaviour. But happiness as eudaimonia has a special meaning, different to modern usage. It is the happiness or moral satisfaction that results from virtuous activity. Moreover, Aristotelian virtues aren't identical to Christian virtues of humility, chastity, obedience, faith, hope and love that are reflected in Kantian ethics to some extent. Conversely, Greek thought prized natural virtues of beauty and power, also favoured by Nietzsche, whereas Christian virtues might be expressing weakness or religious self-abnegation. My final point of contrast between virtue theory conceptual framework and the Kantian is about moral judiciousness. That is, Kant wants to be able to determine correct moral action for every conceivable circumstance. This may not only be a misconstrual of moral life, but also unable to cope with life's complexities. Virtue theory, on the other hand, offers versatility and adaptability to circumstances. Aristotle, for example, allows anger when the circumstances require it. Yet central to this study, virtue theory and the virtues are subject to numerous limitations. One of these is their reliance on nature and social convention that has already been noted. Another is the virtue theory belief in a unity of the virtues which is expressed in different ways. Socrates, Plato and the Stoics, for example, believed in a hierarchy of virtues that were unified and guided by wisdom. Yet Aristotle didn't emphasize wisdom and knowledge as the unifying factor to the same extent of these other thinkers. But he still believed in the unity of virtue in which one virtue could not be held without the others. For Aristotle, for example, a Nazi could not be courageous, which today is a contentious view, and Aristotle's unity extended to the idea that virtue promotes happiness. Yet Aristotle's view of the causes or conditions of happiness seems more realistic than that of the Stoics. Aristotle held that both virtue and good fortune were required to produce happiness. But the Stoics held the hugely optimistic belief that only virtue was required to produce happiness. Yet the unity of the virtues also had to be held together by having a goal or objective. And Aristotle's virtue theory is teleological in that it is directed towards the goal of eudaimonia. And part of Aristotle's eudaimonia is the crowning virtue of magnanimity, which has value content, whereas the crowning virtue of the Stoics is the largely cognitive state of wisdom. Yet, as for all virtue theorists, Aristotle writes, "Will not knowledge of the good have a great influence on life? Shall we not, like archers who have a mark to aim at, be more likely to hit the right thing?" Unquote. It is the goal of eudaimonia that determines what the virtues are aimed at and what they are. Yet the notion of having a clear or certain idea of the goal of life is implausible to many thinkers. For example, commenting on this passage, David Wiggins states that, "But in reality there is no such thing as the good, no such thing as knowledge of it, and nothing fixed independently of ourselves to aim at." And although Wiggins moderates his skepticism in later editions of this work, skepticism of one fixed certain goal remains for all modern thinkers. Yet in that work, Wiggins was writing about the discovery of value focus as essential to the meaning of life. And in our own study, herein, the discovery of value is predicated on its neglect in virtue theory. Despite the recent renaissance of Aristotle's virtue theory, it is thought to lack an appreciation of the concept of value. Yet Karl Marx may have overstated the point in saying that Aristotle had no concept of value. The idea of value was well known in ancient Greece. The word for value in Greek is axia. Aristotle actually coined the word ethics, and like Plato, he discussed inherent or intrinsic good. Yet neither the fact value or the is-ought distinctions were known in ancient Greece. And of course, the concept of value was not used as a principle of ethics. Instead of various applications of value, Aristotelian virtue employs the mental states of character and disposition. But these omit Kantian moral features of goodwill, intention, and the value of people as ends in themselves. Virtue theory also accepted naturalistic ideals without demur as part of the factor-value problem. And Aristotle also fallaciously defined objects by falsely attributing them with value. He defined stones, for example, by attributing them with the value state of purpose, to sink deeper into the ground, and that money could have intrinsic value. Aristotle's neglect of value also detracted from his crowning virtue of magnanimity, or a great-souled person. This is because Aristotle tells us that the primary concern of a great-souled person is honour. But in the modern world, honour is not so highly prized as it used to be. This is because it is thought to be a social endorsement rather than an inner quality. So virtue theory often uncharacteristically neglects executive virtues like goodwill, self-esteem and dignity that don't directly imply action or social endorsement. This difference is explained by Ryan Brown as that between dignity cultures and honour cultures. That is, he says that dignity cultures derive value from our humanity, self-esteem and personal qualities, and that honour cultures derive value from social esteem and reputation. The ancient Greek culture was, of course, highly social, and it even regarded society as essential to one's humanity. Yet I also argue that value has been neglected in the modern world by science, philosophy, epistemology and ethics. And in this respect, we can quote Charles Gray Shaw from a century ago, who said that value as a principle of ethics has been overlooked by both ancient and modern philosophy, unquote. Yet the combined advantages, limitations and predilections of Aristotle's virtue theory leads me to an interpretation of the virtues as value states and as a value theory ethics. I defined value states earlier with the examples like love, hate, dignity, self-esteem, honour and moral fortitude, to which we now need to add the virtues such as courage, loyalty, honesty, generosity and magnanimity. So value states are mental states that necessarily contain both values and phenomenal experience. Cognitive states like thought, perception, reason, belief and memory aren't value states. Yet note that my list includes both positive and negative values, whereas virtue theory has selected out any negative values. Yet the virtues are compatible with value states because they already are virtual value states but reconceived. My proposal is thereby the reconfiguration of virtue theory as a value theory ethics. This retains the advantages of virtue theory while resolving its problems with the concept of value. And what are dispositional virtues can be interpreted as value states. The first of these virtues is justice, which in modern thought is a principle rather than a mental state. Yet for Aristotle, justice is the motivating moral attitude expressed in relations with another person. So in this way, justice can also be interpreted as a value state with moral implications. Aristotle's second virtue of temperance is a balance between the extremes of insensitivity and self-indulgence, whereas insensitivity is a lack of appreciation of the values and concerns of others. Self-indulgence indicates a lack of moral fortitude or substantive value that Bernard Williams had described as the person who cares not so much about other people as himself caring about other people. For Aristotle, the virtue of prudence isn't theoretical knowledge about how to be conservative and cautious, but as the application of practical wisdom to achieve human flourishing. It is a key virtue. And as it entails both good judgment and an appreciation of the good, it would also entail both value and value judgment that just qualifies it as a value state. Courage is the last of the four cardinal virtues that is able to find emotional resources and values within oneself to overcome fear. These emotional resources and values are similar to moral fortitude. These are able to overcome fear by finding purpose and value within oneself that can withstand the loss of equanimity, ease and physical comfort. Yet magnanimity is Aristotle's crowning virtue of the great-souled person, who finds in a generosity of heart not to seek revenge, retribution or compensation for loss or hurt, but expresses greatness and an abundance of value by giving rather than taking. And magnanimity is a primary example of the quality and sufficiency of value that is advocated as an ideal in the value theory ethics pursued herein. Aristotle nevertheless identifies eudaimonia, or human flourishing, as the supreme good, which he qualifies as self-sufficient. As the supreme good, it is a moral concept. It can be inferred to be a sufficiency of value. That is again a description of the goal that value theory ethics is pursuing. So with the addition of the concept of value that virtue theory lacks, virtue theory ethics is ready to be translated into a value theory ethics. Another advantage of both virtue theory and value theory ethics is that they offer internal reasons for action that Kant wanted to with reason, internal to mind. But reason isn't internal to value or the moral will. We have noted some other principles that might be internal to value or the moral will, like love, freedom, authenticity, and perhaps happiness. But these fail to guide action. I will explain how value can guide action soon in a forthcoming study. Yet the pursuit of value is sufficiently specific to guide action. However, the distinction between internal and external reasons for action has been a much debated topic. Bernard Williams, for example, discusses the question with a certain skepticism for external reasons, and John McDowell considers the question of how external reasons might be possible. Yet others like Hume, Nietzsche, Dworkin and Williams believe that ethics should provide its own foundation. Williams makes this point when he says that Nietzsche rightly claims that morality demands to be understood as self-sufficient, and Dworkin speaks of an independence of morality as a separate department of knowledge. Moreover, on a value theory ethics, the values employed are already internal and engaged with the moral will, and the best judgment that one can make on certain criteria really does justify those values. This is because value can be self-validating, that is, as the principle of the will to value. That is, not to value value is contradictory, self-negating, and an erroneous understanding of value. But the prospect of a value theory ethics raises many questions unresolved by a development of virtue theory, such as what is ethics, that it might be resolved by a principle of value. How can a principle be a value imperative that impels the will? And how can particular material action be derived from its formal ethical principle? To begin with, the moral good is often thought to be undefinable, that I do define with the concept of value. And morality can be defined as reflecting moral values as particular injunctions back onto the agent. This reflexivity accords merit or blame to the agent and explains the elevating experience of morality. Yet in the case of value theory ethics, those values are derived from a principle of value, unlike other theories. That is, the principles of other theories of ethics are also values, but the principle of value theory ethics is itself value. For instance, the principles of eudaimonia and excellence of character are the values of virtue theory. The principle of utility to maximize happiness is the central value of utilitarianism, and the principles of reason and goodwill are values for Kantian ethics. That is, for Kantian ethics and utilitarianism, goodwill and happiness are their objectives and their values respectively. But on a value theory ethics, the objective itself is value, that we also value as a principle of ethics. Hence, on a value theory of ethics, we value value as a will to value and as a pursuit of value. And this provides a long sought after definition of ethics. But other issues remain, like how to establish and explain the value imperative that would drive value theory ethics, and how to derive particular material action from formal principles like value or the will to value. This problem has arisen in the case of virtue theory as well as in others, like the principle of love. But the problems of a value imperative and material action will be dealt with in future weeks. Yet we can begin to discuss the question of different reasons for action now. Different ethical theories promote different kinds of reasons for action that suit their different needs. These are cognitive, desire-based, and now a value-based theories of ethics that employ cognitive, desire-based, and value-based theories of action that we outline below. Firstly, a cognitive theory of action typically holds that reason or a conception of things alone can motivate. This view involves the cognitive, non-cognitive debate that I don't need to review here. But non-cognitivists regard cognitive reasons for actions as impotent in motivating action. Secondly, on a desire-based theory of action, a reason for motivation is produced by the satisfaction of a desire. That is, if an action promotes the satisfaction of a desire, we have reason to perform that action. But cognitivists regard non-cognitive reason for action as blind and unable to guide action. But thirdly, a value-based theory of reasons for action draw on values, facts and actions required for certain goals. And those values, facts, actions and goals make them good or worth achieving depending on those goals. On such a value-first ethics, actions are performed to bring about some valuable state of affairs. But the problem for value-based theories is determining the values on which they are based. And perhaps for this reason, Barry Maguire writes about this view as the promising but surprisingly overlooked value-based theory of reasons, unquote. Maguire gives the example of the value of saving a life weighed against certain disvalues. But this strategy adopts accepted values rather than establishing what those values are. For example, Maguire quotes Peter Singer's example of walking past a shallow pond and seeing a child drowning in it. I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing, unquote. But Singer is a utilitarian, which is a theory which presupposes such values. And a value-based theory of reasons is also central to Derek Parfit's eclectic theory of ethics, but his integration of Kantian, contractualist and consequentialist ethics appears to be contradictory. Yet he employed a general framework around how actions promote valuable states of affairs. But Parfit focused on the concept of a reason itself rather than providing a specific account of what is valuable. And he held an objective view of values and reasons, that some reasons are good or bad regardless of belief. And Parfit also contentiously offers irreducible normative moral truths and values as a foundation. Yet here's another argument for such irreducible normative moral truths are inconclusive. So we see in these examples that, like virtue theory, a value theory of reasons offers flexibility, common sense, the internal reason for action that Kant was looking for, but also a fallibilism that he wanted to avoid. Yet it isn't able to offer a sound basis of values as a value theory ethics is purported to do. Yet the arguments for that claim can only be made over the next few studies. So with that, I will round up with a summary and a conclusion. In conclusion, our review of the strengths and weaknesses of virtue theory have led us to value theory ethics. The principal weakness of virtue theory were a neglect of value and a lack of clear principles of action. Its strengths were its versatility, internal reasons for action, and its ability to make human responses. My response to these strengths and weaknesses was to retain the conceptual framework of virtue theory, and this was done by reinterpreting the virtue states as value states, which brought a number of resolutions. For example, the concept of value brought focus to both individual actions and to a final objective. That is, Aristotle's eudaimonia and magnanimity found a parallel with a sufficiency of value, and the introduction of value provides detailed guidance for action. I can also repeat that Aristotle's virtue theory was concerned with life more broadly than just ethical action. Similarly, the principle of the will to value leading to a sufficiency of value is also applicable to every aspect of life, such as meaning, purpose, and value experience. And this points to considerations beyond either ethics or value theory ethics. Yet in this respect, the attractiveness of virtue theory also derives from several features that we can now note. One of these is its modern appreciation of the good life and happiness as human objectives. 2, it is also able to incorporate human judgment with its emphasis on disposition and character. And 3, its idea of internalization has connotations with the modern idea of the unconscious mind. But we can also repeat a list of 8 deficiencies of virtue theory that, in my view, follow from a neglect of value. 1. Virtue theory neglects the intrinsic value of other people as ends in themselves. 2. It also doesn't appreciate goodwill and intention as crucial principles of moral value. 3. It neglects rights and duties not contributing to the good life of the self and the community. 4. And understandably, it doesn't consider the fact, value and is-ought distinctions and the naturalistic fallacy. 5. Unacceptable social endorsement is evident in magnanimity being defined in terms of honour. 6. Yet there is also the outstanding problem of not providing clear principles of action. 7. And as a result of that lack of clarity, it fails to provide an agent's obligation to act. And 8. Eudaimonia as a moral state also unrealistically depended on circumstance and human opportunities. So, considering all these points, I have reinterpreted or replaced virtue theory with value theory ethics. Yet a value imperative and guidance of action still need to be explained, as they will be soon. But in line with my critique of all theories of ethics, value theory ethics is also provisional, and I look forward to working out another non-ethical way of calibrating human thought, value and action in Series 12. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com. I'm interested in knowing if you think I've made a contribution to ethical thought, or whether I have made mistakes that I should be aware of.